then found him tied to a tree she mourned her Lakota warrior for months. The wind moved gently across the wide plains of South Dakota, carrying the soft smell of dry grass and earth. The land stretched far in every direction, open and honest, just like the people who lived there. In a small Lakota community near the edge of the reservation, life moved at a steady and meaningful pace. Families knew one another. Children ran freely between homes. Elders sat outside in the evenings, sharing stories as the sky slowly turned gold. Among the people of that community was a man named Ellen Red Cloud. He was in his early 30s, tall and steady, with dark hair that he often tied back neatly. His eyes carried quiet strength. When he walked, he did not rush. He moved with purpose, as if he respected every step he took on the land of his ancestors. People often called him a warrior, but it was not because he carried any weapon or fought battles. They used that word because of his character. He stood firm in his beliefs. He respected traditions. He protected his culture in ways that were peaceful but powerful. To the elders, he was dependable. To the children, he was inspiring. To his partner, Mariah, he was everything. Elon had grown up listening carefully to the old stories told by his grandfather. As a child, he would sit near the fire during winter evenings, watching the flames dance while his grandfather spoke about the past. He learned about courage, honor, responsibility, and respect. Those lessons shaped him more than any school lesson ever could. He believed that being a Lakota man meant living with balance. It meant caring for the land, speaking truth, and helping others without expecting reward. He carried those values into adulthood. Mariah had first noticed him during a summer gathering several years earlier. He was helping organize a cultural event for the youth. While others were busy setting up chairs and decorations, Ellen was kneeling beside a group of children, patiently teaching them how to introduce themselves in the Lakota language. His voice was calm, and he never raised it. When one of the younger boys stumbled over the words, Elon smiled and encouraged him gently. Mariah watched from a distance that day, feeling something shift inside her. She admired his patience. Later, when they were introduced, she realized he was just as kind in private as he was in public. Their conversations were easy and natural. They spoke about dreams, family, and the importance of keeping traditions alive. Over time, their bond grew strong. They were not loud or dramatic people. Their love was steady, like the sunrise that appeared faithfully every morning over the plains. Elon worked in different ways to support himself and the community. Some days he helped repair fences for ranchers nearby. Other days he volunteered at the tribal school, speaking to teenagers about identity and pride. He believed young people needed to know who they were and where they came from. He told them that knowing their roots would give them strength in a world that sometimes tried to pull them away from their culture. In the evenings, after long days, he and Mariah would walk together across the open fields. The sky would stretch wide above them, painted in shades of orange and pink. They talked about simple things: what they would plant in the spring, how the youth program was going, what the elders had shared that week. But they also had bigger dreams. They wanted to create a small cultural center one day, nothing fancy. Just a place where children could gather to learn traditional songs, beadwork, history, and language. Elon believed that culture was not just something to remember. It was something to live. Mariah supported him completely. She often teased him that he spoke like someone much older, even though he was still young. He would laugh softly and say, "I just listen to the old ones. They already learned what I'm still learning." The community respected him deeply. If someone's truck broke down, Elon showed up. If an elder needed help stacking wood before winter, Elon was there. If a young man felt lost or angry, Elon would sit with him and talk quietly until the tension eased. He never looked for praise. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable when people thanked him too much. He believed helping others was simply part of life. Mariah often watched him from their kitchen window as he worked outside. Sometimes he would be repairing something, his hands steady and focused. Other times he would simply stand still, looking across the land. She once asked him what he was thinking about during those quiet moments. He replied, "I'm listening." "Listening to what?" she asked, smiling. "To the land." "To the wind. To what our ancestors left for us." She did not fully understand what he meant, but she loved that he felt connected to something greater than himself. They lived in a modest house with wooden floors that creaked softly. The walls held framed photos of family members, past and present. A woven blanket made by Mariah's grandmother rested over the back of their couch. On weekends, children from the neighborhood sometimes stopped by. Ellen would sit at the table with them, helping with homework or telling stories about Lakota heroes. He always reminded them that true strength came from kindness and discipline. Being strong doesn't mean being loud, he would say. It means standing firm in who you are. She believed he would be an amazing father someday. They had talked about starting a family once they felt more stable financially. For now, they focused on building their shared vision for the future. As summer faded into autumn, the air grew cooler. The grasses turned golden brown, bending under stronger winds. Ellen spent more time outdoors, helping neighbors prepare for winter. He repaired broken fences and checked on elderly community members who lived alone. There was something almost protective in the way he moved through the community, as if he carried responsibility on his shoulders willingly. One evening, during a small gathering near the community hall, an elder stood and spoke about the importance of modern warriors. He said that warriors today were not defined by physical battles, but by their ability to protect culture, family, and land. Many eyes quietly turned toward Elon. He felt their gaze and looked down modestly. Later that night, as he and Mariah walked home under a sky full of stars, she squeezed his hand. "They were talking about you," she said. He shook his head gently. "They were talking about all of us." But deep down, she knew he carried something special. There was a calm confidence about him, yet also humility. He did not see himself as important. He simply believed in doing what was right. As days passed, small signs of seasonal change appeared everywhere. The mornings became colder. Frost touched the edges of the grass. Elon began planning winter workshops for the youth, wanting to keep them engaged indoors once the snow arrived. Mariah admired his dedication. Sometimes she worried he worked too much, gave too much of himself. "Make sure you rest too," she would remind him. He would say, "There's time." Neither of them knew how precious that time truly was. To the outside world, their life may have looked ordinary. A couple in a rural community, working hard, dreaming quietly. But within that simplicity was depth, love rooted in respect, tradition carried forward with intention, and hope carefully planted for the future. Every morning before leaving the house, Ellen would pause at the doorway. He would look back at Mariah, sometimes saying nothing at all. Other times he would simply say, "See you before sunset." It became their unspoken ritual. And in those peaceful early days of autumn, when the land still felt safe and familiar, no one could imagine that this steady rhythm of life would soon be broken. For now, though, the wind continued to move gently across the plains, and Elon walked forward each day like the warrior his people believed him to be, strong, humble, and deeply connected to the world around him. The morning he left felt no different from any other autumn morning. The sky was pale blue, and a thin layer of frost rested gently over the grass. The air carried that sharp, cold feeling that makes every breath noticeable. Mariah woke before sunrise, as she usually did, and moved quietly around the kitchen. She brewed coffee and watched the light slowly spread across the plains outside their window. Ellen stepped into the kitchen a few minutes later, tying his hair back neatly. He smiled when he saw her standing there with 2 cups already waiting on the table. "You always wake up before the sun," he said softly. "And you always say that?" she replied with a small laugh. They sat together in comfortable silence. There was nothing unusual in the air, no sign that this day would be different. Elon explained that he planned to check on a distant section of fencing near the edge of a wooded area. A neighboring rancher had mentioned that part of it needed repair before winter winds became stronger. "It won't take long," he said. "I'll be back before sunset." Mariah nodded. She had heard those words many times before. It was their quiet routine. He never liked being away after dark unless necessary. Before leaving, he put on his worn brown jacket and sturdy boots. He paused at the doorway, just as he always did. For a moment, he looked at her as if memorizing her face. She teased him gently. "Go. The fence won't fix itself." He smiled again, stepped outside, and closed the door behind him. Mariah watched through the window as he climbed into his truck and drove down the dirt road. The dust rose briefly behind the tires before settling again. Then he was gone from sight. The morning passed normally. Mariah cleaned the house, answered a few phone calls, and visited a neighbor briefly. Around noon, she prepared some food, expecting he might return early if the work went smoothly. But she wasn't worried when he didn't. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather slowly in the distance. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the house with a low hum. Mariah glanced at the clock. It was nearing sunset. She stepped outside and looked down the road. Nothing. He must be finishing up, she told herself. As the sun dipped lower, the sky turned deep orange. The beauty of the evening felt different without him beside her. She tried calling his phone. It rang, but there was no answer. That wasn't completely unusual. Sometimes he kept his phone in his truck while working. She told herself not to overthink. When darkness settled fully over the land, A small uneasiness began to form in her chest. She called again. This time, it rang longer before going silent. She stepped outside once more, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The night felt colder than usual. The plains, which once felt comforting, now seemed too wide and too quiet. By 9 o'clock, she called his cousin Daniel. "Have you heard from him?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No," Daniel replied. "Was he supposed to be back?" "Yes, before sunset." There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "I'll drive toward that direction and check," Daniel said. Mariah thanked him, though her hands had already started to tremble. An hour passed, then another. Daniel called back, his voice more serious now. "I found his truck." Her heart dropped instantly. "Where?" "It's parked off the path." "Is he there?" "I don't see him." The world around her seemed a blur. She grabbed her coat and insisted on coming. Daniel told her to stay home, but she refused. Within minutes, she was riding in another truck toward the location. The drive felt longer than it ever had before. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing only dirt road and scattered brush. The sky above was filled with stars, but they brought no comfort. When they arrived, she saw his truck immediately. It sat slightly angled, as if parked in a hurry. The driver's door was closed. Everything looked strangely normal, yet painfully wrong at the same time. Mariah stepped out before the engine was fully off. She called his name into the night. Her voice echoed lightly against the trees. No answer. Daniel and 2 other community members who had joined began searching the area with flashlights. The wooded patch nearby was not very large, but it was dense enough to hide someone from view. Mariah followed closely behind, refusing to stay back. Twigs snapped under their boots. The cold air felt heavy in her lungs. They called his name again and again. Minutes felt like hours. Then one of the men stopped suddenly. "I see something," he said quietly. Mariah moved forward, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The beam of the flashlight shifted toward a tree deeper inside the wooded area, and there he was. He had been tied to the tree, standing upright but motionless. The sight made everything around her spin. For a moment she could not breathe. "Elon!" she cried, rushing forward. Daniel gently held her back, telling her to wait. He checked first, his face pale under the flashlight's glow. There was no response from Elon. The night fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mariah's knees weakened. She stared at him, unable to understand what she was seeing. Only hours earlier he had been sitting at their kitchen table, speaking about fence repairs and winter plans. Now he stood there, still and quiet, beneath the cold branches of a tree. Authorities were called immediately. The community members stepped back, giving space while staying close to Mariah. She could not take her eyes off him. Her mind raced with questions. Who would do this? Why? How could something like this happen here, in a place where everyone knew one another? The flashing lights of approaching vehicles soon broke the darkness. Officials moved carefully through the wooded area, speaking in low voices. They began documenting the scene. Maria felt disconnected from her body, as if she were watching everything from far away. Daniel wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but she barely noticed the cold anymore. Hours passed in a blur. Questions were asked, notes were taken. The once peaceful land now felt unfamiliar. As dawn slowly approached, the first gray light of morning revealed the full setting. The tree, the frost-covered ground, the quiet fields beyond. It all looked the same as the day before, yet everything had changed. Mariah stood there as long as she was allowed. She whispered softly, though no one else could hear her words. She spoke to him the way she always had, gently, honestly. Eventually she was guided back toward the truck. The drive home felt endless. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in pale colors that felt almost cruel in their beauty. When she entered their house again, it felt different. His boots were still near the door. His coffee cup from that morning still rested in the sink. She walked to the kitchen table and placed her hand on the chair where he had sat just hours before. The silence inside the house was heavier than any silence she had ever known. Outside, the community was already beginning to gather. Word traveled quickly in small places. Shock and confusion spread through every home. No one could understand how the day had started so normally and ended in such a painful discovery. Mariah sat in the quiet of her living room as sunlight filled the space. She stared at the door, almost expecting it to open, and for him to walk in with that calm smile. But it did not. The steady rhythm of their life had been broken in a single night. And as the hours moved forward, the weight of that reality began to settle over her heart. The days that followed felt unreal to Mariah, as if she were walking through a dream she could not wake up from. Morning came, night followed, and time continued moving, but inside her heart, everything felt frozen. The house that once felt warm and full of quiet laughter now felt too large and too silent. News of what had happened spread quickly through the community and beyond. People arrived at her home with soft voices and heavy eyes. Some brought food, some brought blankets. Others brought only their presence, sitting beside her without saying much. No one truly knew what words could make this easier. Authorities continued their investigation. They asked questions about Alan's routine, his work, and anyone who might have had a disagreement with him. Mariah tried to answer clearly, but each question felt like a sharp reminder that he was no longer coming home. Did he mention any concerns recently? No. Was he worried about anything? No. Did he argue with anyone? She shook her head again and again. Elon was not a man who created enemies. He avoided conflict whenever possible. If there was tension, he believed in talking calmly until understanding was reached. That was what made everything so confusing. The community struggled to make sense of it. Some people whispered about possible land disputes in the area. Others wondered if someone passing through had caused trouble. But nothing was confirmed. The lack of clear answers made the situation even harder to accept. Mariah found herself replaying their last morning together repeatedly in her mind. The way he tied his hair. The way he held his coffee cup. The way he paused at the doorway before leaving. She searched those memories for a hidden sign, something she might have missed. But there was nothing. Each evening, she sat near the window, looking out across the plains. The sunset that once brought peace now felt heavy. She missed their evening walks. She missed the sound of his boots against the wooden floor. Even the small things, like the way he hummed quietly while fixing something, echoed in her thoughts. The elders of the community stepped forward to guide the family through traditional practices of remembrance and healing. A gathering was organized to honor Elon's life. People came from nearby towns and neighboring communities. Many had stories to share about him. One young man stood up and spoke about how Elon had helped him during a difficult time. "He told me that knowing who I am would give me strength," the young man said, his voice trembling. "He didn't judge me. He just listened." An elder woman spoke next. She described Elon as someone who carried old wisdom in a young body. "He walked with respect," she said softly. "He remembered where he came from." Mariah listened to each story with tears in her eyes. Hearing how many lives he had touched brought both comfort and pain. Comfort because she realized how meaningful his life had been. Pain because she understood how great the loss truly was. At night, sleep refused to come easily. When she did close her eyes, her mind drifted back to that wooded area. The image would appear without warning. She tried to push it away, but it returned again and again. Daniel visited often, checking on her and helping with practical matters. Paperwork needed to be handled. Phone calls needed to be made. Each task felt exhausting. One afternoon, Mariah walked outside and stood in the yard alone. The wind moved through the tall grass just as it always had. Nature continued without pause. Birds flew overhead. Clouds drifted slowly across the sky. "How can everything look the same?" she whispered to herself. She felt anger rise for the first time. Not loud anger, but deep and quiet. Anger at the situation. Anger at the lack of answers. Anger at the unfairness of it all. But the anger did not last long. It turned into sadness again. Investigators returned several times over the following weeks. They explained that they were reviewing evidence and speaking with individuals who might have information. They asked for patience. Patience felt impossible. The community also felt unsettled. Parents kept closer watch on their children. People avoided walking alone after dark. The sense of safety that once wrapped around the area like a protective blanket had been shaken. Still, there was unity. Prayer circles were organized regularly. Drums echoed across the evening air as people gathered to send strength to Elon's spirit and to Mariah's heart. The steady beat of the drum felt grounding. It reminded everyone that even in sorrow they stood together. Maria attended these gatherings, though at first she could barely speak. She would sit quietly, holding a small photo of Elon in her hands. She traced the edges of the picture with her fingers as if trying to hold on to him physically. An elder man once sat beside her and said gently, "Grief does not move in a straight line. Some days will feel heavier than others, but you are not walking this alone." Those words stayed with her. Weeks turned into a month, then another. The investigation continued quietly in the background, but no clear answers were shared publicly. That uncertainty created a constant ache. Not knowing felt almost as painful as the loss itself. Mariah began visiting the small hill where she and Ellen used to watch sunsets. She would sit there alone, wrapped in a blanket, remembering their conversations about the future. She could almost hear his voice explaining plans for the cultural center they hoped to build. She started writing letters to him in a notebook. She wrote about her days, about who visited, about how the community was doing. It felt strange at first, but it allowed her to release some of the emotions she kept inside. "I wish you would come home that evening," she wrote once. "I keep thinking about that moment." There were days when she felt strong, able to greet visitors and speak calmly about his life, and there were days when she could not get out of bed. The house remained mostly unchanged. His jacket still hung near the door. His tools were still arranged carefully in the shed. She could not bring herself to move them. One afternoon, a group of young students from the tribal school arrived with handmade cards. They stood shyly on her porch until she opened the door. Each card contained drawings of feathers, planes, and messages of gratitude. "Thank you for sharing him with us," one card read. Mariah held those cards close to her chest after they left. She realized that Elon's influence extended far beyond their small home. The community began speaking about continuing his work with the youth. They did not want his efforts to fade away. They wanted his lessons to live on. Still, for Mariah, the absence remained sharp. She sometimes found herself listening for the sound of his truck approaching down the dirt road. The habit was difficult to break. Every engine sound in the distance made her heart jump for a second. Then reality would settle in again. As winter slowly approached, frost became more frequent in the mornings. The land looked beautiful but cold. Mariah often thought about how much Elon loved this season. He always said winter brought clarity. She wondered what clarity could possibly come from this. The questions without answers lingered like a shadow, but within that uncertainty, one truth remained steady. Elon had lived with honor, kindness, and strength. No matter what details the investigation would eventually reveal, nothing could erase the way he had chosen to live. And in the quiet of those long, heavy days, Mariah slowly began to understand that while she could not control what had happened, she could hold on to the values he had carried. The grief was still deep, the confusion was still present. But beneath it all, a small thread of determination began forming inside her. It was not strong yet. Winter arrived quietly but firmly. The first snowfall covered the plains in a soft white blanket, changing the familiar land into something almost unrecognizable. The open fields that once moved with golden grass now lay still and silent. The trees near the wooded area stood bare, their branches thin and fragile against the pale sky. Inside the house, the heater hummed gently, but the warmth did not reach Mariah's heart. Months had passed since that painful night, yet time had not made things easier in the way she once believed it would. People often say that time heals everything, but she was learning that healing was not automatic. It required effort, patience, and courage. Most mornings, she woke before sunrise, just as she used to when Ellen was there. For a few seconds in that quiet space between sleep and full awareness, she would forget. She would expect to hear him moving in the kitchen or tying his hair back. Then reality would settle in again, heavy and cold. She no longer cried every day. The tears had become quieter, appearing without warning rather than flooding all at once. Sometimes they came while she folded laundry. Sometimes while washing dishes. Once, they came simply because she found one of his handwritten notes tucked inside a drawer. It was a simple reminder he had written months earlier. Buy more nails for the shed repair. She held that small piece of paper for a long time. The community continued to support her, but their visits became less frequent as weeks turned into months. Not because they cared less, but because life slowly pulled everyone back into routines. Children returned to school activities. Families prepared for winter gatherings. Work needed to be done. Mariah understood. She did not expect the world to stop forever. But sometimes, when the house felt especially quiet, she wished someone would knock on the door just to sit with her. On colder days, she wrapped herself in a thick blanket and sat by the window, watching snow fall gently over the plains. She remembered how much Elon loved winter evenings. He used to say the silence of snowfall felt sacred, like the land was resting. She tried to see it that way now. The investigation still had not brought clear public answers. Authorities shared little information explaining that the process required time. The uncertainty had become a constant background noise in her life. She no longer waited for daily updates, but the question remained in her heart. Why? Some nights that single word echoed louder than anything else. To cope with the weight of her thoughts, Mariah began attending healing circles organized by the elders. At first she hesitated. Speaking about her pain in front of others felt overwhelming. But the circle was not about forcing words. It was about presence. People sat together in a quiet room lit by soft lamps. A small drum rested at the center. One by one, individuals spoke about their own losses. Parents, siblings, friends. Each story carried sorrow, but also strength. When it was her turn, Mariah's voice shook. "I still feel like he will walk through the door," she admitted. "I still listen for his truck." No one judged. They simply listened. After the circle ended, an older woman placed a hand on her shoulder and said gently, "Grief changes shape over time. It does not disappear, but it becomes something you can carry." Those words stayed with her. At home, she began making small changes. Not big ones, just enough to help her breathe more easily. She moved his boots from the doorway into the closet. It felt like a betrayal at first, as if she were erasing him. But she realized she was not removing his memory. She was creating space to walk without constant pain. She left his jacket hanging, though. She was not ready for that yet. Some afternoons, she visited the small hill where they used to watch sunsets. Even in winter, she would bundle up and sit there for a while. The sky looked different against the snow, softer, almost silver at times. She would close her eyes and remember their conversations about the future. They had dreamed of building a cultural center for the youth, a place filled with language lessons, storytelling, and traditional crafts. That dream felt distant now, almost impossible without him. But one evening, as she sat watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt something shift inside her. She realized that the dream had not belonged to him alone. It belonged to both of them. The thought scared her. It meant stepping forward. It meant moving instead of standing still in grief. For months she had felt like she was walking through thick fog. But now, a small path began to appear. The following week, she spoke with Daniel and a few community members about continuing Elon's youth workshops. At first, her voice felt uncertain. She did not know if she was strong enough. "What if I can't do it the way he did?" she asked. Daniel replied gently, "You don't have to be him. You just have to be you." They organized a small winter gathering at the community hall. It was simple. Just a few families, some elders, and a group of children who had once attended Elon's sessions. Mariah stood at the front of the room, her hands slightly trembling. She took a deep breath. "He believed in teaching our stories," she began. "And I believe we should continue." Some nodded, a few smiled. An elder offered to help with language lessons. Another volunteered to teach beadwork. Slowly, the room filled with ideas. For the first time in months, Mariah felt a spark of warmth that did not come from the heater in her house. The grief did not disappear. It remained present, especially at night when everything was quiet. She still missed the sound of his voice. She still reached for his side of the bed sometimes, only to feel emptiness. But the emptiness no longer felt endless. She started writing again in her notebook, but her words changed. Instead of only expressing sorrow, she began writing plans. Talk to the school about using their classroom once a week. Ask elders to share stories in spring. Look into small grants for community projects. Winter continued, but she no longer viewed it as only cold and harsh. She began to understand what Elon meant about clarity. The quiet season forced her to sit with her pain, to face it honestly, and in doing so, she found strength she did not know she possessed. Some evenings she would stand outside under the stars. The sky in winter looked especially sharp and bright. She would whisper softly into the night, speaking to him as if he could hear. "I'm trying," she would say. "I'm carrying it forward." The months of mourning had changed her deeply. She was no longer the same woman who had waved goodbye that autumn morning. She had been broken open by loss. But within that broken space, something new had begun to grow. Not happiness, not yet, but purpose. And as snow slowly melted toward the end of the season, revealing the brown earth beneath, Mariah realized that healing was not about forgetting. It was about remembering in a way that allowed her to keep living. She still mourned her Lakota warrior. She likely always would. But now, instead of only looking backward at what she had lost, she began to look forward at what she could protect, nurture, and continue. The land outside remained wide and open, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. And for the first time in many months, that openness no longer felt frightening.